Mario and the Magician, by Thomas Mann. The atmosphere of Torre di Venire remains unpleasant in the memory. From the first moment the air of the place made us uneasy. We felt irritable, on edge. Then at the end came the shocking business of Cipolla, that dreadful being who seemed to incorporate, in so fateful and so humanly impressive a way, all the peculiar evilness of the situation as a whole. Looking back, we had the feeling that the horrible end of the affair had been preordained and lay in the nature of things. That the children had to be present at it was an added impropriety, due to the false colors in which the weird creature presented himself. Luckily for them, they did not know where the comedy left off and the tragedy began, and we let them remain in their happy belief that the whole thing had been a play up till the end. Torre di Venire lies some 15 kilometers from Porto Clemente, one of the most popular summer resorts on the Tyrrhenian Sea. Porto Clemente is urban and elegant and full to overflowing for months on end. Its gay and busy main street of shops and hotels runs down to a wide sandy beach covered with tents and pennant sandcastles and sunburnt humanity, where at all times a lively social bustle reigns, and much noise. But this same spacious and inviting fine-sanded beach, this same border of pine grove and near, presiding mountains, continues all the way along the coast. No wonder then that some competition of a quiet kind should have sprung up further on. Torre di Venire Tower that gave the town its name is gone long since. One looks for it in vain is an offshoot of the larger resort, and for some years remained an idol for the few, a refuge for more unworldly spirits. But the usual history of such places repeated itself. Peace has had to retire further along the coast, to Marina Pietriera and dear knows where else. We all know how the world at once seeks peace and puts her to flight, rushing upon her in the fond idea that they two will wed. And where she is, there it can be at home. It will even set up its Vanity Fair in a spot and be capable of thinking that peace is still by its side. Thus Torre, though its atmosphere so far is more modest and contemplative than that of Portoclemente, has been quite taken up by both Italians and foreigners. It is no longer the thing to go to Portoclemente, though still so much the thing that it is as noisy and crowded as ever. One goes next door, so to speak, to Torre, so much more refined even, and cheaper to boot. And the attractiveness of these qualities persists, though the qualities themselves long ago ceased to be evident. Torre has got a grand hotel. Numerous pensions have sprung up, some modest, some pretentious. The people who own or rent the villas and pinetas overlooking the sea no longer have it all their own way on the beach. In July and August it looks just like the beach at Porto Clemente. It swarms with a screaming, squabbling, merrymaking crowd, and the sun, blazing down like mad, peels the skin off their necks. Garish little flat-bottomed boats rock on the glittering blue, manned by children, whose mothers hover afar and fill the air with anxious cries of Nino, and Sandro, and Bice, and Maria. Pedlars step across the legs of recumbent sunbathers, selling flowers and corals, oysters, lemonade, and cornetti al burro, and crying their wares in the breathy, full-throated southern voice. Such was the scene that greeted our arrival in Torre. Pleasant enough, but after all we thought we had come too soon. It was the middle of August. The Italian season was still at its height, scarcely the moment for strangers to learn to love the special charms of the place. What an afternoon crowd in the cafés on the front! For instance, in the Esquisito, where we sometimes sat and were served by Mario, that very Mario of whom I shall have presently to tell. It is well nigh impossible to find a table, and the various orchestras contend together in the midst of one's conversation with bewildering effect. Of course, it is in the afternoon that people come over from Porto Clemente. The excursion is a favorite one for the restless denizens of that pleasure resort, and a Fiat motorbus plies to and fro, coating inch-thick with dust the oleander and laurel hedges along the highroad, a notable if repulsive sight. Yes, decidedly one should go to Torre in September, when the great public has left. Or else in May, before the water is warm enough to tempt the southerner to bathe. Even in the before and after seasons Torre is not empty, but life is less national and more subdued. English, French, and German prevail under the tent awnings and in the pension dining rooms, whereas in August in the Grand Hotel, at least where, in default of private addresses, we had engaged rooms, the stranger finds the field so occupied by Florentine and Roman society that he feels quite isolated and even temporarily déclassé. We had, rather to our annoyance, this experience on the evening we arrived, when we went in to dinner and were shown to our table by the waiter in charge. As a table, it had nothing against it, save that we had already fixed our eyes upon those on the veranda beyond, built out over the water, where little red-shaded lamps glowed, and there were still some tables empty, though it was as full as the dining room within. The children went into raptures at the festive sight, and without more ado we announced our intention to take our meals by preference in the veranda. Our words, it appeared, were prompted by ignorance, for we were informed, with somewhat embarrassed politeness, that the cozy nook outside was reserved for the clients of the hotel. Ai nostri clienti. Their clients? But we were their clients. We were not tourists or trippers, but boarders for a stay of some 3 or 4 weeks. However, we forbore to press for an explanation of the difference between the likes of us and that clientele to whom it was vouchsafed to eat out there in the glow of the red lamps, and took our dinner by the prosaic common light of the dining-room chandelier, a thoroughly ordinary and monotonous hotel bill of fare, be it said. In Pensione Eleonora, a few steps landward, the table, as we were to discover, was much better, and thither it was that we moved, 3 or 4 days later, before we had had time to settle in properly at the Grand Hotel. Not on account of the veranda and the lamps. The children, straightway on the best of terms with waiters and pages, absorbed in the joys of life on the beach, promptly forgot those colorful seductions. But now there arose, between ourselves and the veranda clientele, or perhaps more correctly with the compliant management, one of those little unpleasantnesses which can quite spoil the pleasure of a holiday. Among the guests were some high Roman aristocracy, a Principe X and his family. These grand folk occupied rooms close to our own, and the Principessa, a great and a passionately maternal lady, was thrown into a panic by the vestiges of a whooping cough which our little ones had lately got over, but which now and then still faintly troubled the unshatterable slumbers of our youngest born. The nature of this illness is not clear, leaving some play for the imagination. So we took no offense at our elegant neighbor for clinging to the widely held view that whooping cough is acoustically contagious, and quite simply fearing lest her children yield to the bad example set by ours. In the fullness of her feminine self-confidence she protested to the management, which then, in the person of the proverbial frock-coated manager, hastened to represent to us, with many expressions of regret, that under the circumstances they were obliged to transfer us to the annex. We did our best to assure him that the disease was in its very last stages, that it was actually over, and presented no danger of infection to anybody. All that we gained was permission to bring the case before the hotel physician, not one chosen by us by whose verdict we must then abide. We agreed, convinced that thus we should at once pacify the princess and escape the trouble of moving. The doctor appeared, and behaved like a faithful and honest servant of science. He examined the child and gave his opinion. The disease was quite over, no danger of contagion was present. We drew a long breath and considered the incident closed, until the manager announced that despite the doctor's verdict it would still be necessary for us to give up our rooms and retire to the dependents. Byzantinism like this outraged us. It is not likely that the Principessa was responsible for the willful breach of faith. Very likely the fawning management had not even dared to tell her what the physician said. Anyhow, we made it clear to his understanding that we preferred to leave the hotel altogether and at once, and packed our trunks. We could do so with a light heart, having already set up casual friendly relations with Casa Eleonora. We had noticed its pleasant exterior and formed the acquaintance of its proprietor, Signora Angiolieri, and her husband. She slender and black-haired, Tuscan in type, probably at the beginning of the 30s, with the dead ivory complexion of the southern woman. He quiet and bald and carefully dressed. They owned a larger establishment in Florence and presided only in summer and early autumn over the branch in Torre di Venire. But earlier, before her marriage, our new landlady had been companion, fellow traveler, wardrobe mistress, yes, friend, of Eleonora Duse, and manifestly regarded that period as the CKWN of her career. Even at our first visit she spoke of it with animation. Numerous photographs of the great actress, with affectionate inscriptions, were displayed about the drawing room, and other souvenirs of their life together adorned the little tables and étagères. This cult of a so interesting past was calculated, of course, to heighten the advantages of the signora's present business. Nevertheless, our pleasure and interest were quite genuine as we were conducted through the house by its owner and listened to her sonorous and staccato Tuscan voice relating anecdotes of that immortal mistress, depicting her suffering saintliness, her genius, her profound delicacy of feeling. Thither, then, we moved our effects to the dismay of the staff of the Grand Hotel, who, like all Italians, were very good to children. Our new quarters were retired and pleasant. We were within easy reach of the sea through the avenue of young plane trees that ran down to the esplanade. In the clean, cool dining room Signora Angiolieri daily served the soup with her own hands. The service was attentive and good, the table capital. We even discovered some Viennese acquaintances, and enjoyed chatting with them after luncheon, in front of the house. They, in their turn, were the means of our finding Otherson short. All seemed for the best, and we were heartily glad of the change we had made. Nothing was now wanting to a holiday of the most gratifying kind. And yet no proper gratification ensued. Perhaps the stupid occasion of our change of quarters pursued us to the new ones we had found. Personally, I admit that I do not easily forget these collisions with ordinary humanity, the naive misuse of power, the injustice, the sycophantic corruption. I dwelt upon the incident too much. It irritated me in retrospect quite futilely, of course, since such phenomena are only all too natural and all too much the rule. And we had not broken off relations with the Grand Hotel. The children were as friendly as ever there. The porter mended their toys, and we sometimes took tea in the garden. We even saw the Principessa. She would come out, with her firm and delicate tread, her lips emphatically corollant, to look after her children, playing under the supervision of their English governess. She did not dream that we were anywhere near, for so soon as she appeared in the offing, we sternly forbade our little one even to clear his throat. The heat, if I may bring it in evidence, was extreme. It was African. The power of the sun, directly one left the border of the indigo-blue wave, was so frightful, so relentless, that the mere thought of the few steps between the beach and luncheon was a burden, clad though one might be only in pajamas. Do you care for that sort of thing? Weeks on end? Yes, of course, it is proper to the South, it is classic weather, the son of Homer, the climate wherein human culture came to flower and all the rest of it. But after a while it is too much for me. I reach a point where I begin to find it dull. The burning void of the sky, day after day, weighs one down. The high coloration, the enormous naivete of the unrefracted light, they do, I dare say, induce light-heartedness, a carefree mood born 9F immunity from downpours and other meteorological caprices. But slowly, slowly, there makes itself felt a lack. The deeper, more complex needs of the northern soul remain unsatisfied. You are left barren, even it may be, in time, a little contemptuous. True, without that stupid business of the whooping cough, I might not have been feeling these things. I was annoyed. Very likely I wanted to feel them, and so half unconsciously seized upon an idea lying ready to hand to induce, or if not to induce, at least to justify and strengthen my attitude. Up to this point, then, if you like, let us grant some ill will on our part. But the sea, and the mornings spent extended upon the fine sand in face of its eternal splendors, the sea could not conceivably induce such feelings. Yet it was none the less true that, despite all previous experience, we were not at home on the beach, we were not happy. It was too soon, too soon. The beach, as I have said, was still in the hands of the middle-class native. It is a pleasing breed to look at, and among the young we saw much shapeliness and charm. Still, we were necessarily surrounded by a great deal of very average humanity, a middle-class mob, which, you will admit, is not more charming under this sun than under one's own native sky. The voices these women have. It was sometimes hard to believe that we were in the land which is the western cradle of the art of song. Fuggiero! I can still hear that cry. As for 20 mornings long I heard it close behind me, breathy, full-throated, hideously stressed, with a harsh open E, uttered in accents of mechanical despair. Fuggiero! Rispondi almeno! Answer when I call you. The spin rispondi was pronounced like shop, as Germans pronounce it, and this, on top of what I felt already, vexed my sensitive soul. The cry was addressed to a repulsive youngster whose sunburn had made disgusting raw sores on his shoulders. He outdid anything I have ever seen for ill-breeding, refractoriness, and temper, and was a great coward to boot, putting the whole beach in an uproar one day because of his outrageous sensitiveness to the slightest pain. A sand crab had pinched his toe in the water, and the minute injury made him set up a cry of heroic proportions, the shout of an antique hero in his agony that pierced one to the marrow and called up visions of some frightful tragedy. Evidently he considered himself not only wounded, but poisoned as well. He crawled out on the sand and lay in apparently intolerable anguish, groaning "Obi" and "Oheim," and threshing about with arms and legs to ward off his mother's tragic appeals and the questions of the bystanders. An audience gathered round. A doctor was fetched, the same who had pronounced objective judgment on our whooping cough, and here again acquitted himself like a man of science. Good-naturedly he reassured the boy. telling him that he was not hurt at all. He should simply go into the water again to relieve the smart. Instead of which, Fuguro was borne off the beach, followed by a concourse of people. But he did not fail to appear next morning, nor did he leave off spoiling our children's sandcastles. Of course, always by accident. In short, a perfect terror. And this 12-year-old lad was prominent among the influences that, imperceptibly at first, combined to spoil our holiday and render it unwholesome. Somehow or other there was a stiffness, a lack of innocent enjoyment. These people stood on their dignity just why, and in what spirit it was not easy at first to tell. They displayed much self-respectingness. Towards each other and towards the foreigner their bearing was that of a person newly conscious of a sense of honor. And wherefore? Gradually we realized the political implications and understood that we were in the presence of a national ideal. The beach, in fact, was alive with patriotic children, a phenomenon as unnatural as it was depressing. Children are a human species and a society apart, a nation of their own, so to speak. On the basis of their common form of life, they find each other out with the greatest ease, no matter how different their small vocabularies. Ours soon played with natives and foreigners alike. Yet they were plainly both puzzled and disappointed at times. There were wounded sensibilities, displays of assertiveness or rather hardly assertiveness, for it was too self-conscious and too didactic to deserve the name. There were quarrels over flags, disputes about authority and precedence. Grown-ups joined in, not so much to pacify as to render judgment and enunciate principles. Phrases were dropped about the greatness and dignity of Italy, solemn phrases that spoilt the fun. We saw our two little ones retreat, puzzled and hurt, and were put to it to explain the situation. These people, we told them, were just passing through a certain stage, something rather like an illness, perhaps. Not very pleasant, but probably unavoidable. We had only our own carelessness to thank that we came to blows in the end with this stage, which, after all, we had seen and sized up long before now. Yes, it came to another cross-purposes. So evidently the earlier ones had not been sheer accident. In a word, we became an offense to the public morals. Our small daughter, 8 years old, but in physical development a good year younger and thin as a chicken, had had a good long bathe and gone playing in the warm sun in her wet costume. We told her that she might take off her bathing suit, which was stiff with sand, rinse it in the sea and put it on again, after which she must take care to keep it cleaner. Off goes the costume and she runs down naked to the sea, rinses her little jersey, and comes back. Ought we to have foreseen the outburst of anger and resentment which her conduct, and thus our conduct, called forth? Without delivering a homily on the subject, I may say that in the last decade our attitude towards the nude body and our feelings regarding it have undergone, all over the world, a fundamental change. There are things we never think about any more, and among them is the freedom we had permitted to this by no means provocative little childish body. But in these parts it was taken as a challenge. The patriotic children hooted. Fuguro whistled on his fingers. The sudden buzz of conversation among the grown people in our neighborhood boded no good. A gentleman in city togs, with a not very apropos bowler hat on the back of his head, was assuring his outraged womenfolk that he proposed to take punitive measures. He stepped up to us, and a philippic descended on our unworthy heads, in which all the emotionalism of the sense-loving South spoke in the service of morality and discipline. The offense against decency of which we had been guilty was, he said, the more to be condemned because it was also a gross ingratitude and an insulting breach of his country's hospitality. We had criminally injured not only the letter and spirit of the public bathing regulations, but also the honor of Italy. He, the gentleman in the city togs, knew how to defend that honor and proposed to see to it that our offense against the national dignity should not go unpunished. We did our best, bowing respectfully, to give ear to this eloquence. To contradict the man, overheated as he was, would probably be to fall from one error into another. On the tips of our tongues we had various answers, as that the word hospitality, in its strictest sense, was not quite the right one, taking all the circumstances into consideration. We were not literally the guests of Italy, but of Signora Angiolieri, who had assumed the role of dispenser of hospitality some years ago, on laying down that of familiar friend to Eleonora Duse. We longed to say that surely this beautiful country had not sunk so low as to be reduced to a state of hypersensitive prudishness. But we confined ourselves to assuring the gentleman that any lack of respect, any provocation on our parts, had been the furthest from our thoughts. And as a mitigating circumstance we pointed out the tender age and physical slightness of the little culprit. In vain. Our protests were waved away. He did not believe in them. Our defense would not hold water. We must be made an example of. The authorities were notified by telephone, I believe, and their representatives appeared on the beach. He said the case was mo/to grave. We had to go with him to the municipio up in the piazza, where a higher official confirmed the previous verdict of molto grave. Launched into a stream of the usual didactic phrases, the selfsame tune and words as the man in the bowler hat, and levied a fine and ransom of 50 lire. We felt that the adventure must willy-nilly be worth to us this much of a contribution to the economy of the Italian government. Paid and left. Ought we not at this point to have left Torri as well? If we only had, we should thus have escaped that fatal Cipolla. But circumstances combined to prevent us from making up our minds to a change. A certain poet says that it is indolence that makes us endure uncomfortable situations. The aperçu may serve as an explanation for our inaction. Anyhow, one dislikes voiding the field immediately upon such an event, especially if sympathy from other quarters encourages one to defy it. And in the Villa Eleonora they pronounced as with one voice upon the injustice of our punishment. Some Italian after-dinner acquaintances found that the episode put their country in a very bad light, and proposed taking the man in the bowler hat to task, as one fellow citizen to another. But the next day he and his party had vanished from the beach. Not on our account, of course, though it might be that the consciousness of his impending departure had added energy to his rebuke. In any case his going was a relief, and, furthermore, we stayed because our stay had by now become remarkable in our own eyes, which is worth something in itself, quite apart from the comfort or discomfort involved. Shall we strike sail? Avoid a certain experience so soon as it seems not expressly calculated to increase our enjoyment or our self-esteem? Shall we go away whenever life looks like turning in the slightest uncanny, or not quite normal, or even rather painful and mortifying? No, surely not. Rather stay and look matters in the face. Brave them out. Perhaps precisely in so doing lies a lesson for us to learn. We stayed on and reaped as the awful reward of our constancy the unholy and staggering experience with Cipolla. I have not mentioned that the after-season had begun, almost on the very day we were disciplined by the city authorities. The worshipful gentleman in the bowler hat, our denouncer, was not the only person to leave the resort. There was a regular exodus. On every hand you saw luggage carts on their way to the station. The beach denationalized itself. Life in Torre, in the cafes and the pinitas, became more homelike and more European. Very likely we might even have eaten at a table in the glass veranda, but we refrained, being content at Signora Angiolieri's content, that is, as our evil star would let us be. But at the same time with this turn for the better came a change in the weather. Almost to an hour it showed itself in harmony with the holiday calendar of the general public. The sky was overcast. Not that it grew any cooler, but the unclouded heat of the entire 18 days since our arrival, and probably long before that, gave place to a stifling sirocco air, while from time to time a little ineffectual rain sprinkled the velvety surface of the beach. Add to which, that 2/3 of our intended stay at Torre had passed. The colorless, lazy sea, with sluggish jellyfish floating in its shallows, was at least a change. And it would have been silly to feel retrospective longings after a sun that had caused us so many sighs when it burned down in all its arrogant power. At this juncture, then, it was that Cipolla announced himself. Cavalier Cipolla he was called on the posters that appeared one day stuck up everywhere, even in the dining room of Pensione Eleonora. A traveling virtuoso, an entertainer, forzator, illusionista, prestidigator, as he called himself, who proposed to wait upon the highly respectable population of Torre di Venire with the display of extraordinary phenomena of a mysterious and staggering kind. A conjurer. The bare announcement was enough to turn our children's heads. They had never seen anything of the sort, and now our present holiday was to afford them this new excitement. From that moment on they besieged us with prayers to take tickets for the performance. We had doubts from the first, on the score of the lateness of the hour, 9 o'clock, but gave way, in the idea that we might see a little of what Cipolla had to offer, probably no great matter, and then go home. Besides, of course, the children could sleep late next day. We bought 4 tickets of Signora Angiolieri herself, she having taken a number of the stalls on commission to sell them to her guests. She could not vouch for the man's performance, and we had no great expectations. But we were conscious of a need for diversion, and the children's violent curiosity proved catching. The Cavalier's performance was to take place in a hall where during the season there had been a cinema with a weekly program. We had never been there. You reached it by following the main street under the wall of the palazzo, a ruin with a for sale sign that suggested a castle and had obviously been built in lordlier days. In the same street were the chemist, the hairdresser, and all the better shops. It led, so to speak, from the feudal past the bourgeois into the proletarian, for it ended off between 2 rows of poor fishing huts, where old women sat mending nets before the doors. And here, among the proletariat, was the hall, not much more actually than a wooden shed, though a large one, with a turreted entrance, plastered on either side with layers of gay placards. Some while after dinner, then, on the appointed evening, we wended our way thither in the dark, the children dressed in their best and blissful with the sense of so much irregularity. It was sultry as it had been for days. There was heat lightning now and then and a little rain. We proceeded under umbrellas. Took us a quarter of an hour. Our tickets were collected at the entrance. Our places we had to find ourselves. They were in the 3rd row left, and as we sat down we saw that, late though the hour was for the performance, it was to be interpreted with even more laxity. Only very slowly did an audience, who seemed to be relied upon to come late, begin to fill the stalls. These comprised the whole auditorium. There were no boxes. This tardiness gave us some concern. The children's cheeks were already flushed as much with fatigue as with excitement. But even when we entered, the standing room at the back and in the side aisles was already well occupied. There stood the manhood of Tory de Veneer, all and sundry, fisherfolk, rough and ready youths with bare forearms crossed over their striped jerseys. We were well pleased with the presence of this native assemblage, which always adds color and animation to occasions like the present, and the children were frankly delighted, for they had friends among these people, acquaintances picked up on afternoon strolls to the further ends of the beach. We would be turning homeward, at the hour when the sun dropped into the sea, spent with the huge effort it had made and gilding with reddish gold the oncoming surf, and we would come upon bare-legged fisherfolk standing in rows, bracing and hauling with long-drawn cries as they drew in the nets and harvested in dripping baskets their catch, often so scanty, of fruto di mare. The children looked on, helped to pull, brought out their little stock of Italian words, made friends. So now they exchanged nods with the standing room clientele. There was Gascardo, their Antonio. They knew them by name and waved and called across in half-whispers, getting answering nods and smiles that displayed rows of healthy white teeth. Look, there is even Mario from the Esquisito, who brings us the chocolate. He wants to see the conjurer, too, and he must have come early, for he is almost in front. But he does not see us, he is not paying attention. That is a way he has, even though he is a waiter. So we wave instead to the man who lets out the little boats on the beach. He is there too, standing at the back. It had got to 9:15, it got to almost past. It was natural that we should be nervous. When would the children get to bed? It had been a mistake to bring them, for now it would be very hard to suggest breaking off their enjoyment before it had got well underway. The stalls had filled in time. All Tory apparently was there, the guests of the Grand Hotel, the guests of the Villa Eleonora, familiar faces from the beach. We heard English and German and the sort of French that Romanians speak with Italians. Madame Angiolieri herself sat 2 rows behind us, with her quiet, bald-headed spouse, who kept stroking his mustache with the 2 middle fingers of his right hand. Everybody had come late, but nobody too late. Cipolla made us wait for him. He made us wait. That is probably the way to put it. He heightened the suspense by his delay in appearing. And we could see the point of this, too, only not when it was carried to extremes. Towards 9:30 the audience began to clap, an amiable way of expressing justifiable impatience, evincing as it does an eagerness to applaud. For the little ones, this was a joy in itself. All children love to clap. From the popular sphere came loud cries of "Pronti! Cominciamo!" and lo! It seemed now as easy to begin as before it had been hard. A gong sounded, greeted by the standing rows with a many-voiced "Ah!" and the curtains parted. They revealed a platform furnished more like a schoolroom than like the theater of a conjuring performance, largely because of the blackboard in the left foreground. There was a common yellow hat stand, a few ordinary straw-bottomed chairs, and further back a little round table holding a water carafe and glass, also a tray with a liqueur glass and a flask of pale yellow liquid. We had still a few seconds of time to let these things sink in. Then, with no darkening of the house, Cavalier Cipolla made his entry. He came forward with a rapid step that expressed his eagerness to appear before his public, and gave rise to the illusion that he had already come a long way to put himself at their service, whereas, of course, he had only been standing in the wings. His costume supported the fiction. A man of an age hard to determine, but by no means young, with a sharp, ravaged face, piercing eyes, compressed lips, small black waxed mustache, and a so-called imperial in the curve between mouth and chin. He was dressed for the street with a sort of complicated evening elegance, in a wide black pelerine with velvet collar and satin lining, which, in the hampered state of his arms, he held together in front with his white-gloved hands. He had a white scarf round his neck. A top hat with a curving brim sat far back on his head. Perhaps more than anywhere else the 18th century is still alive in Italy, and with it the charlatan and mountebank type so characteristic of the period. Only there, at any rate, does one still encounter really well-preserved specimens. Cipolla had in his whole appearance much of the historic type. His very clothes helped to conjure up the traditional figure with its blatantly, fantastically foppish air. His pretentious costume sat upon him, or rather hung upon him most curiously, being in one place drawn too tight, in another a mass of awkward folds. There was something not quite in order about his figure, both front and back, that was plain later on. But I must emphasize the fact that there was not a trace of personal jocularity or clownishness in his pose, manner, or behavior. On the contrary, there was complete seriousness, an absence of any humorous appeal, occasionally even a cross-grained pride, along with that curious, self-satisfied air so characteristic of the deformed. None of all this, however, prevented his appearance from being greeted with laughter from more than one quarter of the hall. All the eagerness had left his manner. The swift entry had been merely an expression of energy, not of zeal. Standing at the footlights, he negligently drew off his gloves, to display long yellow hands, one of them adorned with a seal ring with a lapis lazuli in a high setting. As he stood there, his small hard eyes, with flabby pouches beneath them, roved appraisingly about the hall, not quickly, rather in a considered examination, pausing here and there upon a face with his lips clipped together, not speaking a word. Then, with a display of skill as surprising as it was casual, he rolled his gloves into a ball and tossed them across a considerable distance into the glass on the table. Next, from an inner pocket, he drew forth a packet of cigarettes. You could see by the wrapper that they were the cheapest sort the government sells. With his fingertips he pulled out a cigarette and lighted it, without looking, from a quick-firing benzene lighter. He drew the smoke deep into his lungs and let it out again, tapping his foot, with both lips drawn in an arrogant grimace and the gray smoke streaming out between broken and saw-edged teeth. With a keenness equal to his own, his audience eyed him. The youths at the rear scowled as they peered at this cocksure creature to search out his secret weaknesses. He betrayed none. In fetching out and putting back the cigarettes, his clothes got in his way. He had to turn back his pelerine, and in so doing revealed a riding whip with a silver claw handle that hung by a leather thong from his left forearm and looked decidedly out of place. You could see that he had on not evening clothes but a frock coat, and under this, as he lifted it to get at his pocket, could be seen a striped sash worn about the body. Somebody behind me whispered that this sash went with his title of cavalier. I give the information for what it may be worth personally. I never heard that the title carried such insignia with it. Perhaps the sash was sheer pose, like the way he stood there, without a word, casually and arrogantly puffing smoke into his audience's face. People laughed, as I said. The merriment had become almost general when somebody in the standing seats, in a loud, dry voice, remarked, "Buona sera." Cipolla cocked his head. "Who was that?" asked he, as though he had been dared. "Who was that just spoke? Well, first so bold and now so modest? Porra He spoke with a rather high, asthmatic voice, which yet had a metallic quality. He waited. "That was me." A youth at the rear broke into the stillness, seeing himself thus challenged. He was not far from us, a handsome fellow in a woolen shirt, with his coat hanging over one shoulder. He wore his surly, wiry hair in a high, disheveled mop, the style affected by the youth of the awakened fatherland. It gave him an African appearance that rather spoiled his looks. That was me. It was your business to say it first. But I was trying to be friendly." More laughter. The chap had a tongue in his head. "Ha sciolto la salingunolo," I heard near me. After all, the retort was deserved. "Ah, bravo," answered Cipolla. "I like you, Giovanato. Trust me, I've had my eye on you for some time. People like you are just in my line. I can use them, and you are the pick of the lot, that's plain to see. You do what you like. Or is it possible you have ever not done what you liked, or even, maybe, what you didn't like? What somebody else liked, in short? Hark ye, my friend, that might be a pleasant change for you, to divide up the willing and the doing and stop tackling both jobs at once. Division of labor, Sistema Americano, essay. For instance, suppose you were to show your tongue to this select and honorable audience, here your whole tongue, right down to the roots. "No, I won't," said the youth hostilely. "Sticking out your tongue shows a bad bringing up." "Nothing of the sort," retorted Cipolla. "You would only be doing it. With all due respect to your bringing up, I suggest that before I count 10, you will perform a right turn and stick out your tongue at the company here further than you knew yourself that you could stick it out." He gazed at the youth, and his piercing eyes seemed to sink deeper into their sockets. "Uno," said he. He had let his riding whip slide down his arm and made it whistle once through the air. The boy faced about and put out his tongue, so long, so extendedly, that you could see it was the very uttermost in tongue which he had to offer, then turned back, stony-faced, to his former position. "That was me?" mocked Cipolla, with a jerk of his head towards the youth. That was me." Leaving the audience to enjoy its sensations, he turned towards the little round table, lifted the bottle, poured out a small glass of what was obviously cognac, and tipped it up with a practiced hand. The children laughed with all their hearts. They had understood practically nothing of what had been said, but it pleased them hugely that something so funny should happen, straight away, between that queer man up there and somebody out of the audience. They had no preconception of what an evening would be like and were quite ready to find this a priceless beginning. As for us, we exchanged a glance, and I remember that involuntarily I made with my lips the sound that Cipolla's whip had made when it cut the air. For the rest, it was plain that people did not know what to make of a preposterous beginning like this to a sleight-of-hand performance. They could not see why the Giovanato, who after all in a way had been their spokesman, should suddenly have turned on them to vent his incivility. They felt that he had behaved like a silly ass and withdrew their countenances from him in favor of the artist, who now came back from his refreshment table and addressed them as follows. "Ladies and gentlemen," said he, in his wheezing, metallic voice, "you saw just now that I was rather sensitive on the score of the rebuke this hopeful young linguist saw fit to give me. Questo linguista di bel speranza," was what he said, and we all laughed at the pun. I am a man who sets some store by himself, you may take it from me. And I see no point in being wished a good evening unless it is done courteously and in all seriousness. For anything else there is no occasion. When a man wishes me a good evening, he wishes himself one. For the audience will have one only if I do. So this lady killer of Torre di Venire, another thrust, did well to testify that I have one tonight and that I can dispense with any wishes of his in the matter. I can boast of having good evenings almost without exception. One not so good does come my way now and again, but very seldom. My calling is hard and my health not of the best. I have a little physical defect which prevented me from doing my bit in the war for the greater glory of the fatherland. It is perforce with my mental and spiritual parts that I conquer life, which after all only means conquering oneself. And I flatter myself that my achievements have aroused interest and respect among the educated public. The leading newspapers have lauded me. The Corriere della Sera did me the courtesy of calling me a phenomenon, and in Rome the brother of the Duce honored me by his presence at one of my evenings. I should not have thought that in a relatively less important place, laughter here, at the expense of poor little Torre, I should have to give up the small personal habits which brilliant and elevated audiences had been ready to overlook. Nor did I think I had to stand being heckled by a person who seems to have been rather spoilt by the favors of the fair sex. All this, of course, at the expense of the youth whom Cipolla never tired of presenting in the guise of Don Nuevo and rustic Don Juan. His persistent thin-skinnedness and animosity were in striking contrast to the self-confidence and the worldly success he boasted of. One might have assumed that the Giovanato was merely the chosen butt of Cipolla's customary professional sallies, had not the very pointed witticisms betrayed a genuine antagonism. No one looking at the physical parts of the two men need have been at a loss for the explanation, even if the deformed man had not constantly played on the other's supposed success with the fair sex. "Well," Cipolla went on, "before beginning our entertainment this evening, perhaps you will permit me to make myself comfortable," and he went towards the hat-stand to take off his things. "Parla benissimo," asserted somebody in our neighborhood. So far, the man had done nothing, but what he had said was accepted as an achievement. By means of that he had made an impression. Among Southern people, speech is a constituent part of the pleasure of living. It enjoys far livelier social esteem than in the North. That national cement, the mother tongue, is paid symbolic honors down here, and there is something blithely symbolical in the pleasure people take in their respect for its forms and phonetics. They enjoy speaking, they enjoy listening, and they listen with discrimination, for the way a man speaks serves as a measure of his personal rank. Carelessness and clumsiness are greeted with scorn. Elegance and mastery are rewarded with social éclat. Wherefore the small man too, where it is a question of getting his effect, chooses his phrase nicely and turns it with care. On this count, then, at least Cipolla had won his audience, though he by no means belonged to the class of men which the Italian, in a singular mixture of moral and aesthetic judgments, labels simpatico. After removing his hat, scarf, and mantle, he came to the front of the stage, settling his coat, pulling down his cuffs with their large cuff buttons, adjusting his absurd sash. He had very ugly hair. The top of his head, that is, was almost bald, while a narrow, black-varnished frizz of curls ran from front to back as though stuck on. The side hair, likewise blackened, was brushed forward to the corners of the eyes. It was, in short, the hairdressing of an old-fashioned circus director, fantastic, but entirely suited to his outmoded personal type and worn with so much assurance as to take the edge off the public's sense of humor. The little physical defect of which he had warned us was now all too visible, though the nature of it was even now not very clear. The chest was too high, as is usual in such cases, but the corresponding malformation of the back did not sit between the shoulders. It took the form of a sort of hips or buttocks hump, which did not indeed hinder his movements but gave him a grotesque and dipping stride at every step he took. However, by mentioning his deformity beforehand, he had broken the shock of it, and a delicate propriety of feeling appeared to reign throughout the hall. "At your service," said Cipolla. "With your kind permission, we will begin the evening with some arithmetical tests." Arithmetic? That did not sound much like sleight of hand. We began to have our suspicions that the man was sailing under a false flag, only we did not yet know which was the right one. I felt sorry on the children's account, but for the moment they were content simply to be there. The numerical test which Cipolla now introduced was as simple as it was baffling. He began by fastening a piece of paper to the upper right-hand corner of the blackboard. Then, lifting it up, he wrote something underneath. He talked all the while, relieving the dryness of his offering by a constant flow of words, and showed himself a practiced speaker, never at a loss for conversational turns of phrase. It was in keeping with the nature of his performance, and at the same time vastly entertained the children, that he went on to eliminate the gap between stage and audience, which had already been bridged over by the curious skirmish with the fisher lad. He had representatives from the audience mount the stage, and himself descended the wooden steps to seek personal contact with his public. And again, with individuals, he fell into his former taunting tone. I do not know how far that was a deliberate feature of his system. He preserved a serious, even a peevish air, but his audience, at least the more popular section, seemed convinced that that was all part of the game. So then, after he had written something and covered the writing by the paper, he desired that two persons should come up on the platform and help to perform the calculations. They would not be difficult, even for people not clever at figures. As usual, nobody volunteered, and Cipolla took care not to molest the more select portion of his audience. He kept to the populace. Turning to two sturdy young louts standing behind us, he beckoned them to the front, encouraging and scolding by turns. They should not stand there gaping, he said, unwilling to oblige the company. Actually, he got them in motion. With clumsy tread they came down the middle aisle, climbed the steps, and stood in front of the blackboard, grinning sheepishly at their comrades' shouts and applause. Cipolla joked with them for a few minutes, praised their heroic firmness of limb and the size of their hands, so well calculated to do this service for the public. Then he handed one of them the chalk and told him to write down the numbers as they were called out. But now the creature declared that he could not write. "Non so scrivere," said he in his gruff voice, and his companion added that neither did he. God knows whether they told the truth or whether they wanted to make game of Cipolla. Anyhow, the latter was far from sharing the general merriment which their confession aroused. He was insulted and disgusted. He sat there on a straw-bottomed chair in the center of the stage with his legs crossed, smoking a fresh cigarette out of his cheap packet. Obviously it tasted the better for the cognac he had indulged in while the yokels were stumping up the steps. Again he inhaled the smoke and let it stream out between curling lips. Swinging his leg, with his gaze sternly averted from the two shamelessly chuckling creatures and from the audience as well, he stared into space as one who withdraws himself and his dignity from the contemplation of an utterly despicable phenomenon. "Scandalous," said he in a sort of icy snarl. "Go back to your places. In Italy everybody can write. In all her greatness there is no room for ignorance and unenlightenment. To accuse her of them in the hearing of this international company is a cheap joke, in which you yourselves cut a very poor figure and humiliate the government and the whole country as well. If it is true that Torre di Venire is indeed the last refuge of such ignorance, then I must blush to have visited the place, being, as I already was, aware of its inferiority to Rome in more than one respect. Here Cipolla was interrupted by the youth with the Nubian coiffure and his jacket across his shoulder. His fighting spirit, as we now saw, had only abdicated temporarily, and he now flung himself into the breach in defense of his native heath. "That will do," said he loudly. "That's enough jokes about Torre. We all come from the place and we won't stand strangers making fun of it. These two chaps are our friends. Maybe they are no scholars, but even so they may be straighter than some folks in the room who are so free with their boasts about Rome, though they did not build it either." That was capital. The young man had certainly cut his eye-teeth, and this sort of spectacle was good fun, even though it still further delayed the regular performance. It is always fascinating to listen to an altercation. Some people it simply amuses, they take a sort of killjoy pleasure in not being principals. Others feel upset and uneasy, and my sympathies are with these latter, although on the present occasion I was under the impression that all this was part of the show, the analphabetic yokels no less than the giovanotto with the jacket. The children listened well pleased. They understood not at all, but the sound of the voices made them hold their breath. So this was a magic evening. At least it was the kind they have in Italy. They expressly found it lovely. Cipolla had stood up and with two of his scooping strides was at the footlights. "Well, well, see who's here," said he with grim cordiality. "An old acquaintance, a young man with his heart at the end of his tongue." He used the word linguaccia, which means a coated tongue, and gave rise to much hilarity. "That will do, my friends." He turned to the yokels. "I do not need you now. I have business with this deserving young man here, con questo Torrigiano di Ventri, this Tower of Venus, who no doubt expects the gratitude of the fair as a reward for his prowess. "Ah, non scherziamo. We're talking earnest," cried out the youth. His eyes flashed, and he actually made as though to pull off his jacket and proceed to direct methods of settlement. Cipolla did not take him too seriously. We had exchanged apprehensive glances, but he was dealing with a fellow countryman and had his native soil beneath his feet. He kept quite cool and showed complete mastery of the situation. He looked at his audience, smiled, and made a sideways motion of the head towards the young cockerel, as though calling the public to witness how the man's bumptiousness only served to betray the simplicity of his mind. And then, for the second time, something strange happened, which set Cipolla's calm superiority in an uncanny light, and in some mysterious and irritating way turned all the explosiveness latent in the air into matter for laughter. Cipolla drew still nearer to the fellow, looking him in the eye with a peculiar gaze. He even came halfway down the steps that led into the auditorium on our left, so that he stood directly in front of the troublemaker, on slightly higher ground. The riding whip hung from his arm. "My son, you do not feel much like joking," he said. "It is only too natural, for anyone can see that you are not feeling too well. Even your tongue, which leaves something to be desired on the score of cleanliness, indicates acute disorder of the gastric system. An evening entertainment is no place for people in your state. You yourself, I can tell, were of several minds whether you would not do better to put on a flannel bandage and go to bed. It was not good judgment to drink so much of that very sour white wine this afternoon. Now you have such a colic you would like to double up with the pain. Go ahead, don't be embarrassed. There is a distinct relief that comes from bending over in cases of intestinal cramp." He spoke thus, word for word, with quiet impressiveness and a kind of stern sympathy, and his eyes, plunged the while deep in the young man's, seemed to grow very tired and at the same time burning above their enlarged tear ducts. They were the strangest eyes. You could tell that not manly pride alone was preventing the young adversary from withdrawing his gaze. And presently, indeed, all trace of its former arrogance was gone from the bronzed young face. He looked open-mouthed at the cavalier, and the open mouth was drawn in a rueful smile. "Double over," repeated Cipolla. "What else can you do? With a colic like that you must bend. Surely you will not struggle against the performance of a perfectly natural action just because somebody suggests it to you." Slowly the youth lifted his forearms, folded and squeezed them across his body. It turned a little sideways, then bent lower and lower, the feet shifted, the knees turned inward, until he had become a picture of writhing pain, until he all but grovelled upon the ground. Cipolla let him stand for some seconds thus, then made a short cut through the air with his whip and went with his scooping stride back to the little table, where he poured himself out a cognac. "Tout boit beaucoup," asserted a lady behind us. Was that the only thing that struck her? We could not tell how far the audience grasped the situation. The fellow was standing upright again, with a sheepish grin. He looked as though he scarcely knew how it had all happened. The scene had been followed with tense interest and applauded at the end. There were shouts of "Bravo Cipolla" and "Bravo Giovanato." Apparently the issue of the duel was not looked upon as a personal defeat for the young man. Rather, the audience encouraged him as one does an actor who succeeds in an unsympathetic role. Certainly his way of screwing himself up with cramp had been highly picturesque. Its appeal was directly calculated to impress the gallery. In short, a fine dramatic performance. But I am not sure how far the audience were moved by that natural tactfulness in which the South excels, or how far it penetrated into the nature of what was going on. The cavalier, refreshed, had lighted another cigarette. The numerical tests might now proceed. A young man was easily found in the back row who was willing to write down on the blackboard the numbers as they were dictated to him. Him too we knew. The whole entertainment had taken on an intimate character through our acquaintance with so many of the actors. This was the man who worked at the greengrocer's in the main street. He had served us several times with neatness and dispatch. He wielded the chalk with clerkly confidence, while Cipolla descended to our level and walked with his deformed gait through the audience, collecting numbers as they were given in 2, 3, and 4 places, and calling them out to the grocer's assistant, who wrote them down in a column. In all this, everything on both sides was calculated to amuse, with its jokes and its oratorical asides. The artist could not fail to hit on foreigners, who were not ready with their figures, and with them he was elaborately patient and chivalrous, to the great amusement of the natives, whom he reduced to confusion in their turn, by making them translate numbers that were given in English or French. Some people gave dates concerned with great events in Italian history. Cipolla took them up at once and made patriotic comments. Somebody shouted, "Number 1! The cavalier, incensed at this as at every attempt to make game of him, retorted over his shoulder that he could not take less than 2-place figures. Whereupon another joker cried out, "Number 2!" and was greeted with the applause and laughter which every reference to natural functions is sure to win among Southerners. When 15 numbers stood in a long straggling row on the board, Cipolla called for a general adding match. Ready reckoners might add in their heads, but pencil and paper were not forbidden. Cipolla, while the work went on, sat on his chair near the blackboard, smoked and grimaced with the complacent, pompous air cripples so often have. The 5-place edition was soon done. Somebody announced the answer, somebody else confirmed it. A third had arrived at a slightly different result, but the fourth agreed with the first and second. Cipolla got up, tapped some ash from his coat, and lifted the paper at the upper right-hand corner of the board to display the writing. The correct answer, a sum close on 1,000,000, stood there. He had written it down beforehand. Astonishment and loud applause. The children were overwhelmed. How had he done that, they wanted to know. We told them it was a trick not easily explainable offhand. In short, the man was a conjurer. This was what a sleight of hand evening was like. So now they knew. First the fisherman had cramp, and then the right answer was written down beforehand. It was all simply glorious, and we saw with dismay that despite the hot eyes and the hand of the clock at almost 10:30, it would be very hard to get them away. There would be tears. And yet it was plain that this magician did not magic, at least not in the accepted sense of manual dexterity, and that the entertainment was not at all suitable for children. Again, I do not know either what the audience really thought. Obviously, there was grave doubt whether its answers had been given of free choice. Here and there an individual might have answered of his own motion, but on the whole Cipolla certainly selected his people and thus kept the whole procedure in his own hands and directed it towards the given result. Even so, one had to admire the quickness of his calculations, however much one felt disinclined to admire anything else about the performance. Then his patriotism, his irritable sense of dignity, the cavalier's own countrymen might feel in their element with all that and continue in a laughing mood. But the combination certainly gave us outsiders food for thought. Cipolla himself saw to it, though without giving them a name, that the nature of his powers should be clear beyond a doubt to even the least instructed person. He alluded to them, of course, in his talk, and he talked without stopping but only in vague, boastful, self-advertising phrases. He went on a while with experiments on the same lines as the first, merely making them more complicated by introducing operations in multiplying, subtracting, and dividing. Then he simplified them to the last degree in order to bring out the method. He simply had numbers guessed which were previously written under the paper, and the guess was nearly always right. One guesser admitted that he had had in mind to give a certain number, when Cipolla's whip went whistling through the air, and a quite different one slipped out, which proved to be the right one. Cipolla's shoulders shook. He pretended admiration for the powers of the people questioned. But in all his compliments there was something fleering and derogatory. The victims could scarcely have relished them much, although they smiled, and although they might easily have set down some part of the applause to their own credit. Moreover, I had not the impression that the artist was popular with his public. A certain ill will and reluctance were in the air, but courtesy kept such feelings in check, as did Sepola's competency and his stern self-confidence. Even the riding whip, I think, did much to keep rebellion from becoming overt. From tricks with numbers he passed to tricks with cards. There were 2 packs which he drew out of his pockets, and so much I still remember, that the basis of the tricks he played with them was as follows. From the first pack he drew 3 cards and thrust them without looking at them inside his coat. Another person then drew 3 out of the second pack, and these turned out to be the same as the first 3, not invariably all the 3, for it did happen that only 2 were the same. But in the majority of cases Sepola triumphed, showing his 3 cards with a little bow in acknowledgment of the applause with which his audience conceded his possession of strange power, strange whether for good or evil. A young man in the front row, to our right, an Italian with proud, finely chiseled features, rose up and said that he intended to assert his own will in his choice and consciously to resist any influence, of whatever sort. Under these circumstances, what did Sepola think would be the result? "You will," answered the cavalier, "make my task somewhat more difficult thereby. As for the result, your resistance will not alter it in the least. Freedom exists and also the will exists. But freedom of the will does not exist, for a will that aims at its own freedom aims at the unknown. You are free to draw or not to draw. But if you draw, you will draw the right cards, the more certainly, the more willfully obstinate your behavior." One must admit that he could not have chosen his words better, to trouble the waters and confuse the mind. The refractory youth hesitated before drawing. Then he pulled out a card and at once demanded to see if it was among the chosen 3. "But why?" queried Sepola. "Why do things by halves?" Then, as the other defiantly insisted, "E servito," said the juggler with a gesture of exaggerated servility, and held out the 3 cards fanwise, without looking at them himself. The left-hand card was the one drawn. Amid general applause, the apostle of freedom sat down. How far Sepola employed small tricks and manual dexterity to help out his natural talents, the deuce only knew. But even without them the result would have been the same. The curiosity of the entire audience was unbounded and universal. Everybody both enjoyed the amazing character of the entertainment and unanimously conceded the professional skill of the performer. Lavora bene. We heard, here and there in our neighborhood. It signified the triumph of objective judgment over antipathy and repressed resentment. After his last, incomplete, yet so much the more telling success, Sepola had at once fortified himself with another cognac. Truly he did drink a lot, and the fact made a bad impression. But obviously he needed the liquor and the cigarettes for the replenishment of his energy, upon which, as he himself said, heavy demands were made in all directions. Certainly in the intervals he looked very ill, exhausted and hollow-eyed. Then the little glassful would redress the balance, and the flow of lively, self-confident chatter run on, while the smoke he inhaled gushed out gray from his lungs. I clearly recall that he passed from the card tricks to parlor games, the kind based on certain powers which in human nature are higher or else lower than human reason, on intuition and magnetic transmission, in short, upon a low type of manifestation. What I do not remember is the precise order things came in. And I will not bore you with a description of these experiments. Everybody knows them. Everybody has at one time or another taken part in this finding of hidden articles, this blind carrying out of a series of acts, directed by a force that proceeds from organism to organism by unexplored paths. Everybody has had his little glimpse into the equivocal, impure, inexplicable nature of the occult, has been conscious of both curiosity and contempt, has shaken his head over the human tendency of those who deal in it to help themselves out with humbuggery, though, after all, the humbuggery is no disproof whatever of the genuineness of the other elements in the dubious amalgam. I can only say here that each single circumstance gains in weight and the whole greatly in impressiveness when it is a man like Cipolla who is the chief actor and guiding spirit in the sinister business. He sat smoking at the rear of the stage, his back to the audience while they conferred. The object passed from hand to hand which it was his task to find, with which he was to perform some action agreed upon beforehand. Then he would start to move zigzag through the hall, with his head thrown back and one hand outstretched, the other clasped in that of a guide who was in the secret but enjoined to keep himself perfectly passive, with his thoughts directed upon the agreed goal. Cipolla moved with the bearing typical in these experiments, now groping upon a false start, now with a quick forward thrust, now pausing as though to listen and by sudden inspiration correcting his course. The roles seemed reversed. The stream of influence was moving in the contrary direction. As the artist himself pointed out, in his ceaseless flow of discourse, the suffering, receptive, performing part was now his. The will he had before imposed on others was shut out. He acted in obedience to a voiceless common will which was in the air. But he made it perfectly clear that it all came to the same thing. The capacity for self-surrender, he said, for becoming a tool, for the most unconditional and utter self-abnegation, was but the reverse side of that other power to will and to command. Commanding and obeying formed together one single principle, one indissoluble unity. He who knew how to obey knew also how to command, and conversely, the one idea was comprehended in the other, as people and leader were comprehended in one another. But that which was done, the highly exacting and exhausting performance, was in every case the leaders and movers, in whom the will became obedience, the obedience will, whose person was the cradle and womb of both, and who thus suffered enormous hardship. Repeatedly he emphasized the fact that his lot was a hard one, presumably to account for his need of stimulant and his frequent recourse to the little glass. Thus he groped his way forward, like a blind seer, led and sustained by the mysterious common will. He drew a pin set with a stone out of its hiding place in an Englishwoman's shoe, carried it, halting and pressing on by turns, to another Lady Signora Angiolieri and handed it to her on bended knee, with the words it had been agreed he was to utter. "I present you with this in token of my respect," was the sentence. Their sense was obvious, but the words themselves not easy to hit upon, for the reason that they had been agreed on in French. The language complication seemed to us a little malicious, implying as it did a conflict between the audience's natural interest in the success of the miracle, and their desire to witness the humiliation of this presumptuous man. It was a strange sight. Cipolla on his knees before the Signora, wrestling, amid efforts at speech, after knowledge of the preordained words. "I must say something," he said, "and I feel clearly what it is I must say. But I also feel that if it passed my lips it would be wrong. Be careful not to help me unintentionally," he cried out, though very likely that was precisely what he was hoping for. Penses tres fort, he cried all at once in bad French, and then burst out with the required words in Italian indeed, but with the final substantive pronounced in the sister tongue, in which he was probably far from fluent. He said veneration instead of veneration with an impossible nasal. And this partial success, after the complete success before it, the finding of the pin, the presentation of it on his knees to the right person, was almost more impressive than if he had got the sentence exactly right, and evoked bursts of admiring applause. Cipolla got up from his knees and wiped the perspiration from his brow. You understand that this experiment with the pin was a single case, which I describe because it sticks in my memory. But he changed his method several times and improvised a number of variations suggested by his contact with his audience. A good deal of time thus went by. He seemed to get particular inspiration from the person of our landlady. She drew him on to the most extraordinary displays of clairvoyance. "It does not escape me, madam," he said to her, "that there is something unusual about you, some special and honorable distinction. He who has eyes to see descries about your lovely brow an aureola, if I mistake not. It once was stronger than now, a slowly paling radiance. Hush! Not a word! Don't help me. Beside you sits your husband, yes." He turned towards the silent Signor Angiolieri. "You are the husband of this lady, and your happiness is complete. But in the midst of this happiness memories rise. The past, Signora, so it seems to me, plays an important part in your present. You knew a king. Has not a king crossed your path in bygone days?" "No," breathed the dispenser of our midday soup, her golden brown eyes gleaming in the noble pallor of her face. "No, no, not a king. I meant that generally. I did not mean literally a king. Not a king, not a prince, and a prince after all, a king of a loftier realm. It was a great artist, at whose side you once, you would contradict me, and yet I am not wholly wrong. Well then, it was a woman, a world-renowned woman artist, whose friendship you enjoyed in your tender years, whose sacred memory overshadows and transfigures your whole existence. Her name? Need I utter it? Whose fame has long been bound up with the fatherlands, immortal as its own? Eleonora Duse." He finished, softly and with much solemnity. The little woman bowed her head, overcome. The applause was like a patriotic demonstration. Nearly everyone there knew about Signora Angiolieri's wonderful past. They were all able to confirm the cavalier's intuition, not least the present guests of Casa Eleonora. But we wondered how much of the truth he had learned as the result of professional inquiries made on his arrival. Yet I see no reason at all to cast doubt, on rational grounds, upon powers which, before our very eyes, became fatal to their possessor. At this point there was an intermission. Our Lord and Master withdrew. Now I confess that almost ever since the beginning of my tale I have looked forward with dread to this moment in it. The thoughts of men are mostly not hard to read. In this case they are very easy. You are sure to ask why we did not choose this moment to go away, and I must continue to owe you an answer. I do not know why. I cannot defend myself. By this time it was certainly 11, probably later. The children were asleep. The last series of tests had been too long. Nature had had her way. They were sleeping in our laps, the little one on mine, the boy on his mother's. That was, in a way, a consolation, but at the same time it was also ground for compassion and a clear leading to take them home to bed. and I give you my word that we wanted to obey this touching admonition. We seriously wanted to. We roused the poor things and told them it was now high time to go. But they were no sooner conscious than they began to resist and implore. You know how horrified children are at the thought of leaving before the end of a thing. No cajoling has any effect. You have to use force. It was so lovely, they wailed. How did we know what was coming next? Surely we could not leave until after the intermission. They liked a little nap now and again, only not go home, only not go to bed, while the beautiful evening was still going on. We yielded, but only for the moment, of course, so far as I knew, only for a little while, just a few minutes longer. I cannot excuse our staying. Scarcely can I even understand it. Did we think, having once said we had to say B, having once brought the children hither, we had to let them stay? No, it is not good enough. Were we ourselves so highly entertained? Yes and no. Our feelings for Cavalier Cipolla were of a very mixed kind, but so were the feelings of the whole audience, if I mistake not, and nobody left. Were we under the sway of a fascination which emanated from this man who took so strange a way to earn his bread? A fascination which he gave out independently of the program and even between the tricks, and which paralyzed our resolve. Again, sheer curiosity may account for something. One was curious to know how such an evening turned out. Cipolla in his remarks having all along hinted that he had tricks in his bag stranger than any he had yet produced. But all that is not it, or at least it is not all of it. More correct it would be to answer the first question with another. Why had we not left Torre di Venire itself before now? To me the two questions are one and the same, and in order to get out of the impasse I might simply say that I had answered it already. For, as things had been in Torre in general, queer, uncomfortable, troublesome, tense, oppressive, so precisely they were here in this hail tonight. Yes, more than precisely. For it seemed to be the fountainhead of all the uncanniness and all the strained feelings which had oppressed the atmosphere of our holiday. This man whose return to the stage we were awaiting was the personification of all that, and, as we had not gone away in general, so to speak, it would have been inconsistent to do it in the particular case. You may call this an explanation, you may call it inertia, as you see fit. Any argument more to the purpose I simply do not know how to adduce. Well, there was an interval of 10 minutes which grew into nearly 20. The children remained awake. They were enchanted by our compliance, and filled the break to their own satisfaction by renewing relations with the popular sphere, with Antonio, Giscardo, and the canoe man. They put their hands to their mouths and called messages across, appealing to us for the Italian words. Hope you have a good catch tomorrow. A whole netful. They called to Mario, Esquisito Mario. Mario, una sciacolata e biscotti. And this time he heeded and answered with a smile. Subito, signorini. Later we had reason to recall this kindly, if rather absent and pensive smile. Thus the interval passed. The gong sounded. The audience, which had scattered in conversation, took their places again. The children sat up straight in their chairs with their hands in their laps. The curtain had not been dropped. Cipolla came forward again with his dipping stride and began to introduce the second half of the program with a lecture. Let me state once for all that this self-confident cripple was the most powerful hypnotist I have ever seen in my life. It was pretty plain now that he threw dust in the public eye and advertised himself as a prestidigitator on account of police regulations which would have prevented him from making his living by the exercise of his powers. Perhaps this eyewash is the usual thing in Italy. It may be permitted or even connived at by the authorities. Certainly the man had from the beginning made little concealment of the actual nature of his operations. And this second half of the program was quite frankly and exclusively devoted to one sort of experiment. While he still practiced some rhetorical circumlocutions, the tests themselves were one long series of attacks upon the willpower, the loss or compulsion of volition. Comic, exciting, amazing by turns, by midnight they were still in full swing. We ran the gamut of all the phenomena this natural-unnatural field has to show, from the unimpressive at one end of the scale to the monstrous at the other. The audience laughed and applauded as they followed the grotesque details, shook their heads, clapped their knees, fell very frankly under the spell of this stern, self-assured personality. At the same time I saw signs that they were not quite complacent, not quite unconscious of the peculiar ignominy which lay, for the individual and for the general, in Sepola's triumphs. Two main features were constant in all the experiments: the liquor glass and the claw-handled riding whip. The first was always invoked to add fuel to his demoniac fires. Without it, apparently, they might have burned out. On this score we might even have felt pity for the man. But the whistle of his scourge, the insulting symbol of his domination, before which we all cowered, drowned out every sensation save a dazed and outbraved submission to his powii. Did he then lay claim to our sympathy to boot? I was struck by a remark he made. It suggested no less. At the climax of his experiments, by stroking and breathing upon a certain young man who had offered himself as a subject and already proved himself a particularly susceptible one, he had not only put him into the condition known as deep trance and extended his insensible body by neck and feet across the backs of two chairs, but had actually sat down on the rigid form as on a bench without making it yield. The sight of this unholy figure in a frock coat squatted on the stiff body was horrible and incredible. The audience, convinced that the victim of this scientific diversion must be suffering, expressed its sympathy. "Ah, poveretto! Poor soul! Poor soul! Poor soul!" Sepola mocked them, with some bitterness. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are barking up the wrong tree. Sono io tu poveretto. I am the person who is suffering. I am the one to be pitied." We pocketed the information. Very good. Maybe the experiment was at his expense. Maybe it was he who had suffered the cramp when the giovanato over there had made the faces. But appearances were all against it. And one does not feel like saying poveretto to a man who is suffering to bring about the humiliation of others. I have got ahead of my story and lost sight of the sequence of events. To this day my mind is full of the cavalier's feats of endurance. Only I do not recall them in their order, which does not matter. So much I do know, that the longer and more circumstantial tests, which got the most applause, impressed me less than some of the small ones which passed quickly over. I remember the young man whose body Sepola converted into a board, only because of the accompanying remarks which I have quoted. An elderly lady in a cane-seated chair was lulled by Sepola in the delusion that she was on a voyage to India, and gave a voluble account of her adventures by land and sea. But I found this phenomenon less impressive than one which followed immediately after the intermission. A tall, well-built, soldierly man was unable to lift his arm, after the hunchback had told him that he could not, and given a cut through the air with his whip. I can still see the face of that stately, mustachioed colonel smiling and clenching his teeth as he struggled to regain his lost freedom of action. A staggering performance. He seemed to be exerting his will, and in vain. The trouble, however, was probably simply that he could not will. There was involved here that recoil of the will upon itself which paralyzes choice, as our tyrant had previously explained to the Roman gentleman. Still less can I forget the touching scene, at once comic and horrible, with Signora Angiolieri. The cavalier, probably in his first bold survey of the room, had spied out her ethereal lack of resistance to his power. For actually he bewitched her, literally drew her out of her seat, out of her row, and away with him whither he willed. And in order to enhance his effect, he bade Signor Angiolieri call upon his wife by her name, to throw, as it were, all the weight of his existence and his rights in her into the scale, to rouse by the voice of her husband everything in his spouse's soul which could shield her virtue against the evil assaults of magic. And how vain it all was! Sepolo was standing at some distance from the couple, when he made a single cut with his whip through the air. It caused our landlady to shudder violently and turn her face towards him. "Sophronia!" cried Signor Angiolieri. We had not known that Signora Angiolieri's name was Sophronia, and he did well to call. Everybody saw that there was no time to lose. His wife kept her face turned in the direction of the diabolical cavalier, who with his 10 long yellow fingers was making passes at his victim, moving backwards as he did so, step by step. Then Signora Angiolieri, her pale face gleaming, rose up from her seat, turned right round, and began to glide after him. Fatal and forbidding sight, her face as though moonstruck, stiff-armed, her lovely hands lifted a little at the wrists, the feet as it were together. She seemed to float slowly out of her row and after the tempter. "Call her, sir. Keep on calling," prompted the redoubtable man, and Signor Angiolieri, in a weak voice, called, "Sophronia!" Again and again he called. As his wife went further off, he even curved one hand round his lips and beckoned with the other as he called. But the poor voice of love and duty echoed unheard, in vain, behind the lost one's back. The Signora swayed along, moonstruck, deaf, enslaved. She glided into the middle aisle and down it towards the fingering hunchback, towards the door. We were driven to the conviction that she would have followed her master, had he so willed it, to the ends of the earth. "Accident!" cried out Signor Angiolieri, in genuine affright, springing up as the exit was reached. But at the same moment the cavalier put aside, as it were, the triumphal crown and broke off. "Enough, Signora, I thank you," he said, and offered his arm to lead her back to her husband. "Signor," he greeted the latter, "here is your wife. Unharmed, with my compliments, I give her into your hands. Cherish with all the strength of your manhood a treasure which is so wholly yours, and let your zeal be quickened by knowing that there are powers stronger than reason or virtue, and not always so magnanimously ready to relinquish their prey. Poor Signor Angiolieri, so quiet, so bald. He did not look as though he would know how to defend his happiness, even against powers much less demoniac than these which were now adding mockery to frightfulness. Solemnly and pompously the cavalier retired to the stage, amid applause to which his eloquence gave double strength. It was this particular episode, I feel sure, that set the seal upon his ascendancy. For now he made them dance, yes, literally. And the dancing lent a dissolute, abandoned, topsy-turvy air to the scene, a drunken abdication of the critical spirit which had so long resisted the spell of this man. Yes, He had had to fight to get the upper hand, for instance, against the animosity of the young Roman gentleman, whose rebellious spirit threatened to serve others as a rallying point. But it was precisely upon the importance of example that the Cavalier was so strong. He had the wit to make his attack at the weakest point and to choose as his first victim that feeble, ecstatic youth whom he had previously made into a board. The master had but to look at him, when this young man would fling himself back as though struck by lightning, place his hands rigidly at his sides, and fall into a state of military somnambulism, in which it was plain to any eye that he was open to the most absurd suggestion that might be made to him. He seemed quite content in his abject state, quite pleased to be relieved of the burden of voluntary choice. Again and again he offered himself as a subject and gloried in the model facility he had in losing consciousness. So now he mounted the platform, and a single cut of the whip was enough to make him dance to the Cavalier's orders, in a kind of complacent ecstasy, eyes closed, head nodding, lank limbs flying in all directions. It looked unmistakably like enjoyment, and other recruits were not long in coming forward. 2 other young men, one humbly and one well-dressed, were soon jigging alongside the first. But now the gentleman from Rome bobbed up again, asking defiantly if the Cavalier would engage to make him dance too, even against his will. "Even against your will," answered Cipolla, in unforgettable accents. That frightful "Anches non vuol" still rings in my ears. The struggle began. After Cipolla had taken another little glass and lighted a fresh cigarette, he stationed the Roman at a point in the middle aisle, and himself took up a position some distance behind, making his whip whistle through the air as he gave the order, "Ba/la." His opponent did not stir. "Bala," repeated the Cavalier incisively, and snapped his whip. You saw the young man move his neck round in his collar. At the same time one hand lifted slightly at the wrist, one ankle turned outward. But that was all, for the time at least. Merely a tendency to twitch, now sternly repressed, now seeming about to get the upper hand. It escaped nobody that here a heroic obstinacy, a fixed resolve to resist, must needs be conquered. We were beholding a gallant effort to strike out and save the honor of the human race. He twitched but danced not, and the struggle was so prolonged that the Cavalier had to divide his attention between it and the stage, turning now and then to make his riding whip whistle in the direction of the dancers, as it were to keep them in leash. At the same time he advised the audience that no fatigue was involved in such activities, however long they went on, since it was not the automatons up there who danced, but himself. Then once more his eye would bore itself into the back of the Roman's neck and lay siege to the strength of purpose which defied him. One saw it waver, that strength of purpose, beneath the repeated summons and whip-crackings, saw with an objective interest which yet was not quite free from traces of sympathetic emotion, from pity, even from a cruel kind of pleasure. If I understand what was going on, it was the negative character of the young man's fighting position which was his undoing. It is likely that not willing is not a practicable state of mind. Not to want to do something may be in the long run a mental content impossible to subsist on. Between not willing a certain thing and not willing at all, in other words, yielding to another person's will, there may lie too small a space for the idea of freedom to squeeze into. Again, there were the Cavalier's persuasive words, woven in among the whip-crackings and commands, as he mingled effects that were his own secret with others of a bewilderingly psychological kind. "Bala," said he, "who wants to torture himself like that? Is forcing yourself your idea of freedom? Una balletina. Why, your arms and legs are aching for it. What a relief to give way to them there. You are dancing already. That is no struggle anymore. It is pleasure. And so it was. The jerking and twitching of the refractory youth's limbs had at last got the upper hand. He lifted his arms, then his knees, his joints quite suddenly relaxed. He flung his legs and danced. And amid bursts of applause the cavalier led him to join the row of puppets on the stage. Up there we could see his face as he enjoyed himself. It was clothed in a broad grin and the eyes were half shut. In a way, it was consoling to see that he was having a better time than he had had in the hour of his pride. His fall was, I may say, an epic. The ice was completely broken. Sepola's triumph had reached its height. The Circe's wand, that whistling leather whip with the claw handle, held absolute sway. At one time, it must have been well after midnight, not only were there 8 or 10 persons dancing on the little stage, but in the hall below a varied animation reigned, and a long-toothed Anglo-Saxoness in a pince-nez left her seat of her own motion to perform a tarantella in the center aisle. Sepola was lounging in a cane-seated chair at the left of the stage, gulping down the smoke of a cigarette and breathing it impudently out through his bad teeth. He tapped his foot and shrugged his shoulders, looking down upon the abandoned scene in the hall. Now and then he snapped his whip backwards at a laggard upon the stage. The children were awake at the moment. With shame I speak of them. For it was not good to be here, least of all for them. That we had not taken them away can only be explained by saying that we had caught the general devil-may-careness of the hour. By that time it was all one. Anyhow, thank goodness, they lacked understanding for the disreputable side of the entertainment, and in their innocence were perpetually charmed by the unheard-of indulgence which permitted them to be present at such a thing as a magician's evening. Whole quarter hours at a time they drowsed on our laps, waking refreshed and rosy-cheeked, with sleep-drunken eyes, to laugh to bursting at the leaps and jumps the magician made those people up their make. They had not thought it would be so jolly. They joined with their clumsy little hands in every round of applause, and jumped for joy upon their chairs, as was their wont, when Sepola beckoned to their friend Mario from the Esquisito, beckoned to him just like a picture in a book, holding his hand in front of his nose and bending and straightening the forefinger by turns. Mario obeyed. I can see him now going up the stairs to Sepola, who continued to beckon him in that droll picture book sort of way. He hesitated for a moment at first. That, too, I recall quite clearly. During the whole evening he had lounged against a wooden pillar at the side entrance, with his arms folded, or else with his hands thrust into his jacket pockets. He was on our left, near the youth with the militant hair, and had followed the performance attentively so far as we had seen, if with no particular animation and God knows how much comprehension. He could not much relish being summoned thus, at the end of the evening, but it was only too easy to see why he obeyed. After all, obedience was his calling in life. And then, how should a simple lad like him find it within his human capacity to refuse compliance to a man so throned and crowned as Sepola at that hour? Willy-nilly he left his column, and with a word of thanks to those making way for him, he mounted the steps with a doubtful smile on his full lips. Picture a thick-set youth of 20 years, with clipped hair, a low forehead, and heavy-lidded eyes of an indefinite gray, shot with green and yellow. These things I knew from having spoken with him, as we often had. There was a saddle of freckles on the flat nose. The whole upper half of the face retreated behind the lower, and that again was dominated by thick lips that parted to show the salivated teeth. These thick lips and the veiled look of the eyes lent the whole face a primitive melancholy. It was that which had drawn us to him from the first. In it was not the faintest trace of brutality indeed. His hands would have given the lie to such an idea, being unusually slender and delicate even for a Southerner. They were hands by which one liked being served. We knew him humanly without knowing him personally, if I may make that distinction. We saw him nearly every day, and felt a certain kindness for his dreamy ways, which might at times be actual inattentiveness, suddenly transformed into a redeeming zeal to serve. His mien was serious. Only the children could bring a smile to his face. It was not sulky, but uningratiating, without intentional effort to please or, rather, it seemed to give up being pleasant in the conviction that it could not succeed. We should have remembered Mario in any case, as one of those homely recollections of travel which often stick in the mind better than more important ones. But of his circumstances we knew no more than that his father was a petty clerk in the municipio and his mother took in washing. His white waiter's coat became him better than the faded striped suit he wore, with a gay-colored scarf instead of a collar, the ends tucked into his jacket. He neared Cipolla, who however did not leave off that motion of his finger before his nose, so that Mario had to come still closer, right up to the chair seat and the master's legs. Whereupon the latter spread out his elbows and seized the lad, turning him so that we had a view of his face, then gazed him briskly up and down with a careless, commanding eye. "Well, ragazzo mio, how comes it we make acquaintance so late in the day? But believe me, I made yours long ago. Yes, yes, I've had you in my eye this long while and known what good stuff you were made of. How could I go and forget you again? Well, I've had a good deal to think about. Now tell me, what is your name? The first name, that's all I want." "My name is Mario," the young man answered, in a low voice. "Ah, Mario. Very good. Yes, yes, there is such a name, quite a common name, a classic name too, one of those which preserve the heroic traditions of the fatherland. Bravo! Salve!" And he flung up his arm slantingly above his crooked shoulder, palm outward, in the Roman salute. He may have been slightly tipsy by now, and no wonder. But he spoke as before, clearly, fluently, and with emphasis, though about this time there had crept into his voice a gross, autocratic note, and a kind of arrogance was in his sprawl. "Well now, Mario mio," he went on, "it's a good thing you came this evening, and that's a pretty scarf you've got on. It is becoming to your style of beauty. It must stand you in good stead with the girls. The pretty girls of Tory Dash from the row of youths." Close by the place where Mario had been standing, sounded a laugh. It came from the youth with the militant hair. He stood there, his jacket over his shoulder, and laughed outright, rudely and scornfully. Mario gave a start. I think it was a shrug. But he may have started and then hastened to cover the movement by shrugging his shoulders, as much as to say that the neckerchief and the fair sex were matters of equal indifference to him. The cavalier gave a downward glance. "We needn't trouble about him," he said. "He is jealous, because your scarf is so popular with the girls, maybe partly because you and I are so friendly up here. Perhaps he'd like me to put him in mind of his colic. I could do it free of charge. Tell me, Mario, you've come here this evening for a bit of fun, and in the daytime you work in an ironmonger's shop." "In a cafe," corrected the youth. "Oh, in a cafe. That's where Sepola nearly came a cropper. What you are is a cupbearer, a Ganymede like that. It is another classical illusion salvietta. Again the cavalier saluted, to the huge gratification of his audience. Mario smiled too. But before that, he interpolated in the interest of accuracy, I worked for a while in a shop in Porto Clemente. He seemed visited by a natural desire to assist the prophecy by dredging out its essential features. There, didn't I say so? In an ironmonger's shop. They kept combs and brushes. Mario got round it. Didn't I say that you were not always a Ganymede? Not always at the sign of the serviette? Even when Sepola makes a mistake, it is a kind that makes you believe in him. Now tell me, do you believe in me? An indefinite gesture. A halfway answer, commented the cavalier. Probably it is not easy to win your confidence. Even for me, I can see it is not so easy. I see in your features a reserve, a sadness, un tratto di malinconia. Tell me, he seized Mario's hand persuasively. Have you troubles? No, signor, answered Mario, promptly and decidedly. You have troubles, insisted the cavalier, bearing down the denial by the weight of his authority. Can't I see? Trying to pull the wool over Sepola's eyes. Are you? Of course. About the girls, it is a girl, isn't it? You have love troubles? Mario gave a vigorous headshake. And again the Giovanotto's brutal laugh rang out. The cavalier gave heed. His eyes were roving about somewhere in the air. But he cocked an ear to the sound, then swung his whip backwards, as he had once or twice before in his conversation with Mario, that none of his puppets might flag in their zeal. The gesture had nearly cost him his new prey. Mario gave a sudden start in the direction of the steps, but Sepola had him in his clutch. Not so fast, said he. That would be fine, wouldn't it? So you want to skip, do you, Ganymede, right in the middle of the fun? Or, rather, when it is just beginning? Stay with me. I'll show you something nice. I'll convince you. You have no reason to worry. I promise you. This girl, you know her and others know her too. What's her name? Wait, I read the name in your eyes. It is on the tip of my tongue and yours too. Silvestra, shouted the Giovanotto from below. The cavalier's face did not change. Aren't there the forward people? He asked, not looking down, more as in undisturbed converse with Mario. Aren't there the young fighting cocks that crow in season and out? Takes the word out of your mouth, the conceited fool, and seems to think he has some special right to it. Let him be. But Silvestra, your Silvestra, what a girl that is. What a prize. Brings your heart into your mouth to see her walk or laugh or breathe. She is so lovely, and her round arms when she washes, and tosses her head back to get the hair out of her eyes. An angel from paradise. Mario started at him, his head thrust forward. He seemed to have forgotten the audience, forgotten where he was. The red rings round his eyes had got larger. They looked as though they were painted on. His thick lips parted. And she makes you suffer, this angel, went on Sepola. Or, rather, you make yourself suffer for her. There is a difference. My lad, a most important difference, let me tell you. There are misunderstandings in love, maybe nowhere else in the world are there so many. I know what you are thinking. What does this Sepola, with his little physical defect, know about love? Wrong, all wrong. He knows a lot. He has a wide and powerful understanding of its workings, and it pays to listen to his advice. But let's leave Sepola out. Cut him out altogether and think only of Silvestra. your peerless Sylvestra. What? Is she to give any young gamecock the preference so that he can laugh while you cry? To prefer him to a chap like you, so full of feeling and so sympathetic? Not very likely, is it? It is impossible. We know better, Cipolla and she. If I were to put myself in her place and choose between the two of you, a tarry lout like that, a codfish, a C4 urchin and a Mario, a knight of the serviette, who moves among gentlefolk and hands round refreshments with an airy word. But my heart would speak in no uncertain tones, it knows to whom I gave it long ago. It is time that he should see and understand, my chosen one. It is time that you see me and recognize me. Mario, my beloved, tell me, who am I? It was grisly, the way the betrayer made himself irresistible, wreathed and coquette with his crooked shoulder, languished with the puffy eyes, and showed his splintered teeth in a sickly smile. And alas, at his beguiling words, what was come of our Mario? It is hard for me to tell, hard as it was for me to see. For here was nothing less than an utter abandonment of the inmost soul, a public exposure of timid and deluded passion and rapture. He put his hands across his mouth, his shoulders rose and fell with his pantings. He could not, it was plain, trust his eyes and ears for joy, and the one thing he forgot was precisely that he could not trust them. Sylvestra, he breathed, from the very depths of his vanquished heart. Kiss me, said the hunchback. Trust me, I love thee. Kiss me here. And with the tip of his index finger, hand, arm, and little finger outspread, he pointed to his cheek, near the mouth. And Mario bent and kissed him. It had grown very still in the room. That was a monstrous moment, grotesque and thrilling, the moment of Mario's bliss. In that evil span of time, crowded with a sense of the elusiveness of all joy, one sound became audible, and that not quite at once, but on the instant of the melancholy and ribald meeting between Mario's lips and the repulsive flesh which thrust itself forward for his caress. It was the sound of a laugh, from the Giovanato on our left. It broke into the dramatic suspense of the moment, coarse, mocking, and yet, or I must have been grossly mistaken, with an undertone of compassion for the poor bewildered, victimized creature. It had a faint ring of that poveretto which Cipolla had declared was wasted on the wrong person, when he claimed the pity for his own. The laugh still rang in the air when the recipient of the caress gave his whip a little swish, low down, close to his chair leg, and Mario started up and flung himself back. He stood in that posture staring, his hands one over the other on those desecrated lips. Then he beat his temples with his clenched fists, over and over, turned and staggered down the steps, while the audience applauded, and Cipolla sat there with his hands in his lap, his shoulders shaking. Once below, and even while in full retreat, Mario hurled himself round with legs flung wide apart. One arm flew up, and two flat shattering detonations crashed through applause and laughter. There was instant silence. Even the dancers came to a full stop and stared about, struck dumb. Cipolla bounded from his seat. He stood with his arms spread out, slanting as though to ward everybody off, as though next moment he would cry out, "Stop! Keep back! Silence! What was that?" Then, in that instant, he sank back in his seat, his head rolling on his chest. In the next he had fallen sideways to the floor, where he lay motionless, a huddled heap of clothing with limbs awry. The commotion was indescribable. Ladies hid their faces, shuddering, on the breasts of their escorts. There were shouts for a doctor, for the police. People flung themselves on Mario in a mob, to disarm him, to take away the weapon that hung from his fingers, that small, dull metal, scarcely pistol-shaped tool with hardly any barrel in. How strange and unexpected a direction had fate leveled it. And now finally, at last we took the children and led them towards the exit, past the pair of carabiniers just entering. Was that the end? They wanted to know that they might go in peace? Yes. We assured them that was the end. An end of horror, a fatal end. And yet a liberation, for I could not, and I cannot but find it so. The end.